What we're witnessing right now is genuinely extraordinary. The decision that's just been taken in Washington represents something far more significant than most people realize. This isn't simply another trade dispute or border disagreement. What Trump has just announced regarding Mexico carries implications that could fundamentally reshape the entire North American economic architecture and, by extension, the global balance of power itself. Now, I want to be very clear about what's actually happening here because the mainstream coverage is missing the deeper strategic dimension entirely. This move against Mexico, and I use that phrase deliberately, isn't occurring in isolation. It's part of a broader recalibration of American foreign policy that we've been tracking for some time. The economic leverage being applied here has precedence, certainly, but the timing and the specific mechanisms being employed suggest something quite different from previous administrations. What makes this particularly fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint is how it intersects with America's relationships across Latin America, its ongoing tensions with China, and the fundamental question of whether the post-Cold War international order can survive in its current form. The ramifications extend far beyond trade tariffs or immigration policy. Let me begin by setting the scene properly, because context is absolutely essential to understanding what's unfolded here. We need to go back and look at the historical relationship between the United States and Mexico, and I don't mean going back centuries, though that history is certainly relevant. I'm talking about the more recent evolution of this relationship, particularly since the implementation of NAFTA in the 1990s, and then its replacement with the USMCA under Trump's first administration. That agreement, you'll recall, was presented as a significant improvement over NAFTA, addressing what Trump and his advisors saw as fundamental imbalances in the original arrangement. But what we're seeing now suggests that even those revisions weren't sufficient to address the underlying concerns that continue to animate American policy toward its southern neighbor. Now, the specific measures that Trump has announced need to be examined very carefully. We're talking about a multi-pronged approach that combines economic pressure with security demands in a way that we haven't really seen before, at least not with this degree of intensity and coordination. The tariff threats alone would be significant, but they're being coupled with very specific demands regarding border enforcement, cartel activity, and migration flows. This is where it gets particularly interesting from an analytical perspective, because what Trump is essentially doing is treating Mexico not as an equal partner in a bilateral North American arrangement, but rather as a state that needs to be brought into compliance with American security imperatives. That's a fundamentally different relationship dynamic, and it represents a departure from decades of diplomatic convention. The Mexican government's initial response has been measured, which is understandable given the enormous economic stakes involved. Mexico's economy is deeply integrated with the United States in ways that simply cannot be unwound quickly or easily. We're talking about supply chains that have been built up over 30 years, manufacturing operations that span both sides of the border, and trade relationships that employ millions of people in both countries. The automotive industry alone represents a staggering level of cross-border integration, with components crossing the border multiple times during the manufacturing process. So when Trump threatens substantial tariffs, he's not just threatening Mexican exporters, he's potentially disrupting entire industrial ecosystems that American companies depend on as well. But here's where we need to be very careful in our analysis. The conventional wisdom, which you'll hear repeated endlessly in the media, is that these tariff threats are primarily negotiating tactics, that Trump is using the threat of economic pain to extract concessions, and that ultimately some sort of compromise will be reached that allows both sides to claim victory. And there may be some truth to that interpretation. Trump has certainly used this playbook before, and it has occasionally worked, at least in producing agreements that he could present as wins. However, I think we need to consider the possibility that something more fundamental is at work here. The demands being made aren't simply about trade balances or minor adjustments to existing agreements. They're about sovereignty, security, and the basic question of which government controls what happens on Mexican territory. The migration issue is absolutely central to this entire situation, and it's worth spending some time on this because it's where economics, security, and domestic politics all intersect. The numbers of people crossing the southern border have fluctuated enormously over the past several years, and while there's been a recent decrease from the peaks we saw in late 2023 and early 2024, the overall level remains historically very high. Now, from Trump's perspective, and from the perspective of his core supporters, this represents an ongoing crisis that demands immediate and dramatic action. The argument being made is that the Mexican government either cannot or will not do what's necessary to control these flows, and therefore the United States must use whatever leverage it has to compel Mexican cooperation. The Mexican government's position, conversely, is that migration is a hemispheric challenge that requires a hemispheric solution, that people are leaving Central America, South America, and even countries further afield because of violence, poverty, and lack of opportunity, and that Mexico itself is simply a transit country dealing with flows it didn't create. There's obviously merit to this argument, and the situation is indeed extraordinarily complex, involving factors that no single government can fully control. But from Washington's current perspective, that complexity is irrelevant. What matters is results, and specifically results that can be measured in terms of reduced border crossings. The cartel issue adds another layer of complexity that really cannot be overstated. The power of the Mexican drug cartels has grown to the point where they essentially control territory within Mexico, collect taxes, provide certain services, and operate what amount to parallel governance structures in significant parts of the country. This isn't hyperbole, it's a reality that Mexican officials themselves acknowledge, even if they dispute the extent of cartel control. The violence associated with cartel activity has been devastating, with homicide rates in Mexico that would be considered catastrophic in most other contexts. And of course, the cartel's primary business model depends on the American market for illegal drugs, particularly fentanyl and methamphetamine, which are now manufactured on an industrial scale. Trump's demands regarding the cartels are essentially that Mexico treat them as what he calls terrorist organizations and wage an all-out war against them, with American assistance if necessary. Now, this sounds straightforward enough, but anyone who's followed Mexico's security situation over the past 2 decades knows that previous attempts at militarized campaigns against the cartels have had mixed results at best and catastrophic consequences at worst. The Calderon administration's frontal assault on the cartels in the late 2000s and early 2010s led to an explosion of violence as cartels fragmented and fought each other for territory. Tens of thousands of people died, and the security situation in many parts of Mexico deteriorated significantly. Subsequent Mexican governments have tried different approaches, including the current administration's policy of prioritizing social programs and economic development over direct military confrontation, what's sometimes called the hugs not bullets approach. Though that's a somewhat reductive characterization, what Trump is proposing would essentially require Mexico to reverse this policy and return to a militarized confrontation with the cartels, and to do so with a level of intensity and commitment that would make previous efforts look modest by comparison. The question is whether the Mexican government is willing or even able to do this, and what the consequences would be for Mexican society if it did. We could very easily see violence spiral completely out of control, with cartels fighting both the government and each other, with civilian casualties mounting, and with the potential for state institutions to be overwhelmed. It's a genuinely frightening scenario, and it's one that Mexican officials are acutely aware of. But from Trump's perspective, these are Mexico's problems to solve, and if economic pressure is required to force action, then so be it. This gets to a fundamental difference in how the two governments conceptualize sovereignty and responsibility. The American position is essentially that Mexico must control what happens on its territory, and if it cannot do so, then American interests give the United States the right to impose consequences. The Mexican position is that these are shared challenges requiring cooperative solutions, and that unilateral American pressure is both counterproductive and disrespectful of Mexican sovereignty. Now, let's talk about the broader geopolitical context, because this confrontation between Washington and Mexico City isn't happening in a vacuum. China looms large in this entire discussion, even though it might not be immediately obvious why. The concern in Washington, which has been growing for years now, is that Mexico could potentially serve as a backdoor for Chinese goods to enter the American market while avoiding tariffs. There's evidence that some Chinese companies are indeed establishing operations in Mexico specifically to take advantage of USMCA provisions, and this has alarmed American officials who see it as circumventing the entire purpose of their trade policy toward China. So part of what's driving American demands for changes in how Mexico manages its economy and its trade relationships is this concern about Chinese economic influence in the Western Hemisphere. This connects to a much larger strategic question about whether the United States can maintain a sphere of influence in its own hemisphere at a time when China is expanding its economic and diplomatic presence globally, including in Latin America. We've seen significant Chinese investment in infrastructure projects throughout the region, Chinese loans to governments that might otherwise have difficulty accessing capital, and growing trade relationships that are diminishing Latin American countries' relative dependence on the United States. This is a development that makes American strategists deeply uncomfortable because hemispheric dominance has been a cornerstone of American grand strategy since the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s. Mexico is obviously the most important country in this context because of geography, economic integration, and the sheer scale of the bilateral relationship. If Mexico were to significantly diversify its economic relationships away from the United States and toward China, that would represent a major geopolitical shift with implications far beyond trade statistics. Now, I should say that there's no indication the Mexican government is planning any such dramatic reorientation, and indeed, the economic logic argues strongly against it given how integrated the two economies already are, but the mere possibility is enough to influence American policy, and it helps explain why Washington is so insistent on maintaining leverage over Mexican decision-making. The energy dimension of this relationship is also worth examining, though it gets less attention than it probably deserves. Mexico has substantial oil reserves and production capacity, and energy trade between the two countries flows in both directions, with the United States exporting natural gas to Mexico and importing crude oil, though in smaller quantities than in the past. Energy security considerations give both countries reasons to maintain good relations, but they also create potential pressure points that could be exploited in a serious confrontation. If the United States were to restrict natural gas exports to Mexico, for instance, that would have immediate and severe consequences for Mexican electricity generation and industrial production. Conversely, any disruption to Mexican oil exports would affect American refineries that are configured to process Mexican crude grades. The humanitarian dimension of all this cannot be ignored, even though it tends to get subordinated to economic and security considerations in policy discussions. We're talking about real human beings whose lives and livelihoods are affected by these high-level strategic decisions. Mexican workers who depend on exports to the United States, American consumers who benefit from lower-cost goods produced in Mexico, migrants who are fleeing violence and poverty and seeking safety and opportunity, families that are separated by borders and immigration policies. All of these people are impacted by what's decided in Washington and Mexico City. The human cost of getting this wrong, either through excessive confrontation or through inadequate attention to genuine security concerns, could be enormous. There's also the question of precedent and what this means for American relations with other countries. If the United States is willing to use this level of economic coercion against its neighbor and treaty partner, what does that signal to other countries about the reliability of American commitments and the value of entering into agreements with Washington? This is a question that's being asked not just in Mexico City, but in capitals around the world. The predictability and rules-based nature of international economic relations has been one of America's greatest assets in maintaining its global position. If that predictability erodes, if agreements are seen as subject to unilateral reinterpretation based on domestic political considerations, then the entire architecture of American global influence comes into question. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are legitimate American concerns driving this policy. The fentanyl crisis in the United States is real and devastating, with overdose deaths reaching levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The sense among many Americans that the border is not adequately controlled is genuine, whether or not one agrees with how that concern is being addressed politically. And the conviction that previous approaches to these problems have failed is widely held across the American political spectrum, even if there's disagreement about what alternative approaches should look like. So while we can critique the specific methods being employed, and while we can question whether economic coercion is the right tool for addressing what are ultimately complex social and security challenges, we should recognize that the problems Trump is claiming to address are not invented or merely rhetorical. The question then becomes whether the approach being taken is likely to produce the desired results, or whether it will instead generate backlash, instability, and unintended consequences that make the situation worse. History suggests that we should be very cautious about the effectiveness of coercive approaches to complex social problems. Pressuring Mexico to militarize its response to the cartels could easily backfire. Threatening massive tariffs could disrupt supply chains and hurt American businesses and consumers as much as or more than Mexican interests. Creating a sense of crisis in the bilateral relationship could push Mexico to diversify its partnerships in ways that reduce American influence over the long term. What we're really witnessing is a test of whether the United States can maintain hegemonic control over its near abroad in an era of globalization and multipolarity. The old methods of influence, economic integration, security cooperation, diplomatic engagement, are being supplemented or replaced by more explicitly coercive measures. Whether this represents a sustainable approach or a sign of declining influence, desperately trying to assert itself through force, is the fundamental question. And the answer to that question will shape not just US-Mexico relations, but the entire structure of the international system for years to come. The Mexican government finds itself in an extraordinarily difficult position. It cannot simply capitulate to American demands without appearing weak domestically and potentially destabilizing its own political situation. But it also cannot afford a genuine rupture in the relationship given Mexico's economic dependence on access to the American market. This means we're likely to see a prolonged period of negotiation, brinkmanship, and incremental adjustments as both sides try to find an accommodation that allows them to claim some measure of success. The danger is that miscalculation or domestic political pressures could cause the situation to spiral beyond anyone's control. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it's occurring at a time of broader global instability and reorientation. The war in Ukraine continues, tensions with China remain high, the Middle East is in turmoil, and the international economic system is under strain from multiple directions. In this context, a major confrontation between the United States and Mexico would represent yet another source of instability and uncertainty at precisely the moment when the world can least afford it. The stakes, in other words, extend far beyond the bilateral relationship and touch on fundamental questions about how the 21st century international order will function or fail to function. This is why the world is watching what happens next with such intense interest, and why the decisions made in the coming weeks and months could indeed change everything,